Hello, welcome to our webinar on Industrial Organization and Agricultural Economics, Trends and Frontiers, brought to you by CFAIR, the Council on Food, Agricultural, and Resource Economics. My name is Lauren Chenerides, and I am a CFAIR board member. It's my pleasure to be moderating today's webinar. Christian Rojas, professor and chair of the Department of Resource Economics at UMass Amherst, is co-organizer of the October CFAIR webinar and is joining us to moderate the Q&A portion of today's event. It's CFAIR's mission to translate high-level research and knowledge to a diverse audience that includes policymakers, elected officials, and federal administrators. When we demonstrate the value of the profession to these groups, the Council increases public appreciation for research, extension, outreach, and academic programs in agricultural and applied economics. Before we get started, I'd like to share some details and background for today's topic. The October CFAIR webinar highlights recent work on industrial organizations in agricultural economics, with a focus on how methods and applications have evolved and what they mean for today's food and agricultural markets. Presentations will include an overview and history of the contributions of IO research in agricultural economics, an examination of applications to labor markets and food retail, and adapting Ag.io to the realities of modern agricultural markets, particularly contract procurement. Together, the speakers will connect lessons from past scholarship to the realities of modern agricultural markets and discuss how these insights can inform research, policy, and practice. CFAIR has assembled a panel of experts to discuss their work, starting with Doruk Cengiz. Doruk is a senior research fellow at the University of Massachusetts Amherst and a decision science manager at Travelers Insurance. His research focuses on the application of machine learning and artificial intelligence methodologies to empirical questions in economics. His work has been published in leading academic journals, including the Quarterly Journal of Economics, Journal of Labor Economics, and the International Journal of Forecasting. Timothy Richards is the Morrison Chair of Agribusiness at the W.P. Carey School of Business at Arizona State University. He has a degree in economics and finance from the University of British Columbia and a PhD in applied economics from Stanford University. He is the former co-editor of the American Journal of Agricultural Economics and is currently the managing editor of the European Review of Agricultural Economics. Lastly, Rich Sexton is a distinguished professor emeritus in the Agricultural and Resource Economics Department at UC Davis. Dr. Sexton served as the chair of the department at University of Davis from 1994 to 1998 and from 2011 to 2016. He's been co-editor of the American Journal of Agricultural Economics from 98 to 2000. He's a past president of the AAEA, or the Agricultural and Applied Economics Association, and was designated as a fellow of the AAEA in 2004. So before I turn things over to our panelists, I'd like to remind you that you can submit questions for the speakers in the chat box at any time. We'll hold all Q&A to a final portion of our webinar in a Q&A session at the end of all the presentations, where we'll be joined by all of our panelists. So with that, I will hand it over to Doruk, who will start us off. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lauren. Thank you, everyone, for being here today. Today, we're going to talk about 50 years of IO in agricultural economics, a paper I co-wrote with Christian Rojas. The paper is going to be published in Journal of Agricultural and Resource Economics. And if you can move to the next slide, you can see how it looks like on SSRN as of today. So feel free to download the whole paper if you feel like it. We can move to the next slide. So the motivation of this paper was an insight from Christian saying that, hey, I believe IO-themed research is becoming more and more popular in agricultural and resource economics in the recent times. So we said, let's do a little bit of more rigorous analysis, go beyond insights. And we're going to talk about the analysis, but we did confirm that inside 20% of papers published in RE, agricultural and resource economics, were IO themed back in 80s, and now it's close to 35%. Now, if you consider the fact that there are more papers published in RE journals right now, you can see that the number of papers published, IO-themed papers published in RE, has gone up significantly. Another question might be, okay, this is great, IO-themed papers are being published in RE, but are they as impactful, or are they getting as many citations as their econ counterparts recently? Now, if you got your PhD in 1980s, 90s, and if you were interested in IO, probably you thought RAND is the name of the game. If you can publish in RAND, you're going to get a ton of citations. Recently, that dynamic has changed a little bit. Some RE papers, even though they are not specifically IO themed necessarily, but IO themed papers in RE journals are receiving as many citations as their econ counterparts. If you look at the table here, if you're trying to publish an IO themed paper, maybe it's a better idea to target AJE or AEPP than IJIO these days. Back in the day, it was a little bit different. So then we asked the question, so what is going on here? What happened? How similar or different is IO in econ versus IO in RE? We can move to the next slide. So what do we do basically? How are we trying to answer that question? The first thing we do is that we collect all the abstracts from top 10 RE journals and leading 5 IO journals. The exact list of the journals are written in the next slides, also in the paper as well. But the idea here is that we got a comprehensive list of article abstracts from these journals, so almost 30,000. Then we also gathered citation data, both from Google Scholar and Web of Science. Google Scholar is a little bit more comprehensive, but it also includes papers that are not really peer-reviewed. Web of Science is a little bit more limited, a little bit more focused, one can argue. So we collected these things. In terms of method, we did use AI pretty heavily, particularly the models produced by OpenAI, but one can try other models as well. I'm pretty sure it's going to give the same results. We basically extracted topics, methods, we classified text using AI. Once we do that, of course, we have an idea about what happened in the papers. So then we said, what do experts think will happen in the future? What do they think about the field's evolution in the past, and what do they think is about to happen? We can move to the next slide. So a couple of key findings here. First off, RE, Agricultural and Resource Economics, IO theme papers in Agricultural and Resource Economics, and IO in Econ, they both shifted more towards downstream topics. That means consumer demand and preferences, food, climate, digitization, retail. The last two is probably more relevant to e-commerce, but they all moved towards downstream topics. Methods, however, do diverge between Econ IO and IO in RE. IO in RE employs a little bit more reduced form methods, relies more on descriptive studies and less on structural modeling. Econ IO, on the other hand, is sticking with causal and more structural modeling recently. Now, that might be, you may say, okay, is this the cause of this differences in citation patterns? IO in Econ is getting less citations these days, and RE is getting more citations. We don't necessarily claim that, but we do find an association between practical relevance, impact, and the citation numbers. So RE papers tend to be a little bit more accessible, not just to academics, but also business and policy leaders. So we see that being an effect in the, I shouldn't say effect, but we see that being associated with higher citations. We can move to the next slide. So this is the whole scale of what we're going to talk about today. Don't worry, most of them we're going to pretty quickly skip them, but let's go to the next slide. So the data, as I mentioned, we collected almost 30,000 paper abstracts, and we also provide here what share of papers have we been able to find the citations numbers. As you can quickly see here, percent scholar, meaning percent Google Scholar citations we found in of those papers is usually around 90%, if not 99%, and Web of Science tends to be a little bit lower. Like I said, it's a little bit more focused. We can move to the next slide. So the methodology. Now we have used LLMs quite heavily. One of the things we used LLMs for was to get the topics from AI. Now we did also provide topics ourselves, but I think this one might be more interesting to this audience, where we asked AI to create topics from those 30,000 articles. Now we did divide those 30,000 articles into groups. They're not mutually exclusive. One group is entire RE, one group is IO in RE, and the other group is IO in Econ. IO in RE is obviously a subset of entire RE. The way we did it is that once we collected the abstracts, we created 20 topics from those abstracts using LLM. That's the first step we did. And the second step, as you can see, it's going in parallel, we collected embeddings, text embeddings from abstracts and embeddings for these topics. Now, embeddings, you can think of them as like you have a text and you're transforming that text into a vector. That is not 2 3-dimensional vector. That tends to be, in our case, more than 3,000 dimensional vector. And individual numbers don't mean a lot, but the direction of the vector means everything in this case. If the direction is pretty close, that means they are talking about similar things. And if you have two vectors, just like we have here, one abstract, one topic, you can basically find an angle between those vectors and calculate cosine similarities. The more similar they are, the more relevant they are. We did assign each abstract to one of the topics. We didn't go beyond that. One can very welcome to do that. In our case, for descriptive purposes, we want to stick with that. We can move to the next slide. And we also classified whether a paper is touching IO topics, and we also assessed methodology used in paper using these AI methods. We can move to the next slide. So very quickly, as I mentioned, both RE, IO in RE, and IO in Econ, they all tend to focus more on downstream topics. IO in Econ, we see rise in topics where data availability is better as well, such as antitrust or auctions. We can move to the next slide. So in terms of methods, all of them, so both of them, I should say, following somewhat similar patterns in the share of empirical articles. Obviously, IO in RE is going up, but the IO in Econ is pretty flat. But if you look at share of structural articles, we almost see a scissors here. You know, IO in RE is focusing less and less on structural modeling, and IO in Econ is doing the opposite at this point. It's focusing more and more on the structural modeling. We can move to the next slide. And finally, in terms of influence, as I alluded to at the top of this conversation, the RE journals, when they publish IO papers, they're getting as many citations as their IO in Econ counterparts these days. Like I mentioned, back in the day, RAND was the name of the game. If you publish there, you're going to get a ton of citations. These days, that's not exactly the case, in the sense that food policy, in terms of an average paper, IO-themed average paper in food policy, tends to get more citation than RAND. We can move to the next slide. We can skip this as well, because I also talk about this in the conclusion. So very quickly, it seems like RE's main strength is its relevance to industry, policymakers, and consumers. There is an interdisciplinary component there, and we believe it is associated with higher citations. Now, there is a discrepancy between perception and reality. They tend to, especially RE scholars, tend to underestimate the influence and impact of RE journals. We do want to point that out. This field looks up to mainstream Econ, which is perfectly fine, but maybe at the expense of its own journals. We would like to point that out in here. And finally, there is definitely a demand to raise methodological bar. This comes from the expert surveys. People want to see kind of combination of methods from empirical IO and data science, and maybe a little bit of geospatial analysis. But yeah, that's what we saw in our study. And thank you so much all for listening to it.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Doruk. Next, we'll be hearing from Tim Richards. Tim.
All right, thanks, Lauren. Yeah, fascinating. Thanks, Doric. That is probably one of the most influential presentations I've seen in a long time. You know, Christian and Doric shared their slides with me and the paper with me months ago. So I made that the center of a talk that I gave at the European Association meetings in Bonn. You know, as editors, we like to think about where things are going in the field and, you know, what the demand for readership and what the supply coming from our scholars is actually doing. So I want to drill down on just one point of that. Can I see the next slide? So this is, you know, among all the slides, if you read the full paper, there's tons of data in there, and they're all very fascinating. But this is the one that struck me as being the most important, at least from my perspective. It's just the share of structural modeling is declining in Ag Econ, in IO, and is rising in general Ag Econ. What do I think about that? Next slide, please. It breaks my heart. No, just kidding. You know, I've done structural modeling for 30 some years. You know, I joke that it breaks my heart, but you know, you think about behind that. Why is it happening? You know, what are we leaving on the table when we move to, you know, more models of, I call them reduced form or causal inference, or models that don't use structural methods? What are we leaving on the table? Next slide, please. So from my perspective, you know, I've argued for a long time that some policy relevant insights are only available through structural models. What are some of those things that that maybe we're not addressing that we need to? You know, the classic example of market power, right, is just due to the elasticity of demand. And we can recover those in a manner of speaking, you know, using reduced form models. But what are the deeper sorts of insights that we're not getting at if we don't use structural modeling? So I just want to provide a few examples today of just 4 of them. There's lots more than this, and I'll talk about that at the end. But talking about vertical relationships and bargaining in labor markets, you know, I do a lot of work at the interface between labor and IO, and bargaining on a dyad basis, you know, individuals bargaining with their employers, firms bargaining with each other. And beyond that, there's a new literature in the general econ field that looks at bringing back GE models, CGE models, general equilibrium, you know, looking at really complicated problems that revolve around relationships between individual firms and individual players in the market, kind of a micro foundation sort of approach. And then finally, I want to look at just some examples of hyper-local competition and where we're going with sort of the next iteration of traditional IO models. Next slide, please. Okay, so the first one, vertical relationships and bargaining. You know, this is just I refer to it as a seminal example, but it goes back, the literature goes back to the 1980s and actually to 1950 with John Nash is the kind of the core of this Nash bargaining solution. But the interesting point about looking at individual bargaining relationships with vertical partners, and I think Rich is going to talk a bit about contracting, and this is what it goes to, right? Most relationships that are of interest to us in ag and resource econ now are dyad based. They're individual firms that are negotiating with each other. So just for example, the reason why we want to use bargaining methods or why they're important is that we can get fundamentally different conclusions with models like that relative to, you know, older models of just looking at market power and you know, market-based models and things like that. The whole crux of bargaining models is that bargaining power rises. You know, the share of the economic surplus in any transaction rises if you can reduce the value of the next best alternative to your bargaining partner. So if you apply that fundamental logic to all sorts of different arrangements between vertical partners, you can get fundamentally different conclusions. Merger incentives, Horn and Walensky classically show that retailers can actually be better off if suppliers merge because their next best alternative is a lower value. So retailers have a higher bargaining power in that. Channel negotiations are fundamentally different if you look at them from a bargaining power perspective. Wholesale price discrimination in the AJE, you know, Koichi Yanazawa and I showed years ago that Robinson-Patman makes no sense from a bargaining perspective. You know, they realized back in the 30s that it wasn't going to make any sense anyways, but that's just another reason why it doesn't make sense. And I guess a rationalization for why it doesn't. Next slide, please. With respect to the IO and labor market connection, For years, I've been looking at these models of search, match, and bargaining. Again, it goes beyond labor markets to individual relationships between employers and employees. Chris Flynn in 2006, Econometrica is kind of the seminal reference here. He looks at how within a micro foundations model of a fundamentally macro model, how can we get these insights from these IO-based models of labor markets that kind of change the way that we think about the way that labor markets work. For example, there's a big literature that looks at imperfect competition in labor markets. How can we measure the extent of labor market markdowns in relationships between employers and employees? We can only look at those in the context of imposing a certain type of equilibrium on the market, and that's one where employees and employers search optimally, they meet, and then they bargain over the implied surplus. That's really the only way we can estimate markdowns, the only way we can estimate labor productivity conditioned on the fact that it is an equilibrium choice from employers and employees. And it's really the only way we can talk about labor market shortages too. People in industry complain about shortages all the time, but economists have a hard time thinking about shortages, right? Because there can't be shortages in any market because they tend to clear. So how do we define shortages? And that's what got me thinking about this whole search, match, and bargaining equilibrium and the sorts of insights we can take from that. Okay, next slide, please. And third one, these new macro GE models. I do a lot of work on supply chain resilience, and supply chain is sort of a business way of thinking about empirical IO models. Just recently, the literature in general econ with some of the top people in the field, Darren Acemoglu and people like that, have been thinking about supply chain resilience and what it takes for a supply chain to be resilient. There's a bunch of scholars here at Arizona State University that look at supply chains as complex adaptive systems. And that's basically what these CGE modelers are looking at. And the key components of those models are these relationship-specific investments that improve resilience. Think contracting, two parties will invest in making a relationship deeper. They have relationship-specific investments, and that causes these supply chains to be less resilient if those relationships tend to break apart. The key part there is that these supply networks tend to self-organize. That means that they are inherently general equilibria sorts of things, and there's lots going on there. It depends upon the resilience of a supply chain. Depends upon the stability of the network, because these networks as self-organizing complex systems tend to want to move away from these, any disruption that diverges from what their equilibrium should have been. Next slide, please. Okay, just in terms of a more traditional sort of IO topic, thinking about how retailers compete. We used to think about, on a market level, how market power parameters change and things like that. There's a new literature that looks more at this hyperlocal competition. The idea is that retailers only compete with the retailers across the street from them. And the court narrative in the Kroger Albertsons case last fall made that pretty clear as these executives talked about exactly how retailers compete in markets. Moreover, that these retailers compete on shopping baskets, not just on individual products and categories and things like that. And they tend to sell the same center of store items, meaning cereal and condiments and things like that. And they really do compete on perishables and random weight items in the sort of retail nomenclature. And they also compete on service quality too, stocking rates and things like that. So when we want to talk about competition in these markets, we have to think about multiple dimensions of competition and not just prices as we used to think in the 70s and 80s. Next slide. So just to wrap it up, I don't think we should abandon structural models for policy analysis, just because these models of causal inference and things are in some sense trendy. There's just some insights that we can only get from structural modeling. I mentioned several of them, and I didn't even touch on dynamic models. And I think there's lots of insights that we can take from dynamic models that are fundamentally different from, reduced form static models. Then there's lots of other examples, but structural modeling still has a place. All right, thanks.
Oh, great. Thank you so much, Tim. And now to our final panelist, Rich Sexton. Rich, I'll turn it over to you. Rich, can you just go off mute? Your mic is muted. There you go.
Okay, sorry, I had tried to turn it on. Sorry, everybody. I want to talk to you a little bit this morning about what I consider to be the key IO issues in what I call modern agricultural markets. So next slide, please. Next slide, please. So a very, very brief history, and we have to back up. Doruk talked a little bit about this in his presentation, but when I entered the profession in the mid-1980s, everybody was still working with what's known as a structure conduct performance paradigm, and that was a loose framework to be sure, but there was the belief that there was a causal relationship from market structure in terms of things like market concentration, brand differentiation, and so forth, that then determined market conduct, which they measured in terms of pricing, advertising, profits, and so forth. And then finally to performance in terms of the economic welfare of farmers and consumers versus the profits that were being earned by the market intermediaries. And typically these frameworks ended up in terms of reduced form regressions of dubious merit, wherein they were regressing prices or profits in an industry on things like concentration, amount of advertising. Advertising was a bad thing for the structure conduct performance people, and so on. But then it wasn't so long after that, in the late 1980s, that the so-called new industrial organization took hold. And then these were characterized by structural models of industry behavior under alternative forms of market power, right? So these are basically, in terms of agricultural markets, a retail demand model, a farm supply model, and then models describing intermediary behavior. And they were very flexible. And what a lot of us call the FOO model, the flexible oligopoly, oligopsony model, it took hold during those periods, and it's still useful in some contexts today that I will try to make clear. But with this model, you're able to specify market power on the unit interval from 0, which is perfect competition, to 1, which would be pure monopoly or monopsony. And then that led to empirical tests where people were actually testing relatively rigorously for the extent of market power in different industries. As time went on, sort of the econometric problems with these approaches became known as well. But what I want to say today is that it's time, at least in many industries, to move on to frameworks that can depict modern agricultural markets. Next slide, please. So what's different today, say, from when I entered the profession, is that apart from a few major industries, namely the grains and oilseeds, the product is transacted through the supply chain via contracts in the Western countries, the US, Europe, and if you've got a spot market model, you're not going to be able to accurately reflect behavior in these contract markets. Tim talked about that a little bit. And then in the developing world, they are certainly becoming an emergent phenomenon as well. So we've got to be able to understand behavior under contract procurement. And part and parcel with this process has been the streamlining of supply chains and the elimination of lots of intermediaries. So today, food manufacturers, in some cases retailers themselves, are engaging directly with farmers, grower shippers via contracts, and then contracts also govern exchange between food manufacturers and retailers or food service establishments. And we don't know much about these contracts typically because they're confidential. But one thing I do know, for example, is that they may run a year or 2 years in duration and very often have fixed prices. And so a lot of times we spend lots of energy thinking about how prices are transmitting from farm to retail and so forth. And we aren't really taking into account that contracts are fixing that transmission so that prices aren't going to transmit the way they would do with spot markets. And then I say that these major players, food manufacturers and retailers, have substantial sunk investments. And I'll just let that go for a second. But we have to realize that that's true in terms of, you think of a modern agricultural processing plant, It may be an investment of hundreds of millions of dollars, and it's not good for anything except processing and handling a particular agricultural product, whether it's beef, cattle, processing tomatoes. It's not good for anything else. Next slide, please. Some more differences today versus say 40 years ago. Product differentiation across all stages of the supply chain, including even the farm level, with the emergence of these so-called credence attributes. As soon as you have differentiation, brand differentiation, product differentiation, what have you, as a seller, you face a downward sloping demand, which means you have market power. So the competitive market model probably still has some applications, but anytime people are selling differentiated products, it doesn't apply anymore. And we have to think about how firms behave when they have a downward sloping demand curve. Tim talked about this a bit, but a dramatic change in agricultural markets literally worldwide over the last few decades, it's been chronicled by people like Tom Reardon and so forth, has been the international grocery chains displacing traditional specialized retailers worldwide. They're the most powerful players in the food supply chains basically across the world. And our models today of retailer behavior generally tend to fall dismally short of reflecting the reality. The reality is things like zone pricing. Stores across a wide geographic area have the same prices. They're pricing to sell market baskets. Very, very important is to preserve your customer base. So maybe you're going to keep stable prices so your customers have loyalty in that respect. And even though, as Dilruk said, policymakers care more about intermediaries' power as in terms of more downstream emphasis, in terms of market power, but the policymakers care much more about intermediaries' power as buyers from farmers than sellers to consumers. And that's manifest in various different ways depending upon where in the world you are. Next slide, please. Next slide, thank you. So contract markets, as Tim said, they should maximize the total size of the pie, the economic surplus available. Both parties to a contract should seek to achieve that. So the deadweight losses that a lot of us were conditioned to think about in terms of IO and market power shouldn't arise in contracts, and the contract terms involve the division of the pie. Who gets what share of the market surpluses? Unfair trade practices that the Europeans worry about generally reduce the size of the pie, and they should be rare in contract agriculture. And our buyers in modern food supply chains, food manufacturers, retailers, food service, they want to establish long-run symbiotic relationships with a relatively few highly reliable suppliers. It results in more concentration across the stages, less of a role for small farmers. A lot of people don't like that, but it's a very efficient way to produce food. And do the buyers in these settings want to screw over their suppliers? Of course they don't, right? Those suppliers are integral to the long-run viability of the facility, the processing plant, the retail establishment that the buyers are operating. And so that's what I call modern agricultural markets, and it changes some of the way we think about market power on its head. Next slide, please. So to wrap up, I just got a slide that says, what's the good, the bad, and the ugly in market settings? And it might not seem right to you, but good market structures can be highly concentrated markets where all the participants have a long-run commitment to the market, i.e. through sunk, or e.g. through high sunk investment costs. So they're there for the long run. And that's when these symbiotic buyer-seller relationships can emerge, and the contract terms will maximize the market surplus, i.e. they will be efficient. Loose oligopolies can be and oligopsonies can be some of the worst market power scenarios, because yes, there's market power there, but there's a tragedy of the commons element involved in terms of preserving the stock of farmers that are supplying this industry, right? Because you only have maybe 20 or 25% of the market, and there's a free rider element to preserving the stock. And then what I call ugly markets are the markets in the emerging economy farm markets that are dominated by itinerant traders, and there's no barriers to buyer collusion. And so, The development economists are slow to recognize this. They say, oh, there's a lot of traders out there buying that product. It must be competitive. It's not competitive. They collude freely. I've seen that in many, many industries. They collude freely, and they're not even embarrassed in terms of talking, e.g., to a surveyor about colluding. And so, those are very bad market structures. But the legal enforcements, if antitrust laws exist in those places, they tend not to be enforced. So those are very bad market structures for farmers, in these emergent economies, and the development economists are starting to get to understand that. And that's it for me. Thank you.